So everyone plays Magic differently, and some people like playing Magic on a budget. Well, in today's video, we'll be diving into some more budget decks for all you guys who enjoyed my last video I made on budget decks. Each one of these decks I kind of put together with a little bit of inspiration from decks I found online, but with the spin on it that we're playing it on a budget. So some of the decks may seem familiar to you, but we are playing a limited amount of rares in the decks for the most part. So I limit myself to maximum of 4 rares in a deck, just because it's, you know, cheaper on you wild card wise in that sense for MTG Arena, or if you play physical Magic, it's cheaper on you for your pockets because commons and uncommons are typically cheaper to buy for the most part. With that being said, guys, hey everybody, it's Scar TV. Welcome to the video. If you're new here and like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps me out a lot. Lets me know you guys like these style of videos. If you want to know when I post new videos like this on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive into the first deck and let's talk about it. So this first deck is kind of an interesting one. I would say it's that flex kind of in between, kind of being, I would say, pretty good to being, you know, a few cards away from being like a pretty powerful deck. If you haven't seen, we are looking at a Golgari Elves deck. Elves seem pretty interesting. I don't think they've really seen any sort of breakout in the competitive scene as a whole, but they are a fun tribe to play in a sense. And we kind of, you know, play around with a few cards to kind of make the deck work for the time being until we can kind of get ourselves more rare cards. We kind of use some snow into the deck to kind of make it hopefully a little bit better, to add some, you know, diversity to the deck in that sense, you know, getting that Kaldheim flavor as a whole. But with that being said, the deck is pretty straightforward. We're trying to do, we're just trying to get a bunch of elves on the battlefield. The rare we are going with for the elves that I think is a must to kind of make it work and kind of keep the momentum of the deck going is the Elvish War Master. Essentially, his ability is whenever one or more elves enter the battlefield under our control, we get a green 1/1 elf warrior creature token, and this ability triggers only once each turn. So essentially, every time we play a single elf, we'll get a 1/1 on top of it, so making our value very good overall. And then the end, in the end of the game, or we're getting close to the end of the game, we can tap 7 mana. Elves we control get +2/+2 and gain Death Touch, which is, I think, fairly strong in the sense that when you can string in very aggressively, your opponent kind of has to block. Especially if you have like 5, 6, 7 elves on the battlefield from, you know, elf warrior tokens, what other elves you have on the battlefield. And essentially, when they do block, they have Death Touch. Our creatures will have Death Touch, meaning that whatever they block with will die in the process, cleaning the battlefield up to hopefully then maybe following turn we can swing in a little bit more aggressively and finish them off if we didn't finish off the turn before. So I do like Elvish War Master out of all the elves that you could possibly choose for the rares. He is kind of like, I would say, the elf lord in a way, just to kind of help us produce more elves at a very cheap and affordable way. But going over the rest of the cards in the deck are pretty simple and straightforward to kind of like give us an idea of, you know, where to start. I threw Blizzard Brawl in the deck because we are doing that little bit of snow spin. I like the idea here that it's a kind of like a removal spell in the sense that we can tap 1 mana. If we have 3 or more snow permanents on the battlefield, we give target creature +1/+0 and make it fight another creature. And it gains indestructible as well. So it creates like a good way for us to remove creatures off the battlefield, because green doesn't have too much in the way of removal. So I think this is a pretty good fight spell, especially from Kaldheim. For 1 mana, I think overall it's a good play in this deck. We got Jasper the Sentinel. It's a 1 mana 1/2 reach elf rogue, and we can tap an untap creature we control, add 1 mana of any color. I actually like this too because rogues is like a flying deck, and there's some other flying decks in the format, and this is a good way to block those creatures. As well as we can play a creature for like 2 mana the turn after. We can actually tap that creature down and maybe play an additional creature and or a spell. I kind of like that diversity that you can play a creature who has summon and sickness to produce that additional mana to actually create mana, which is definitely pretty cool. I threw some Heartless Act in the deck as removal. You can kind of, you know, play around with this, eliminate. I also have Poison in the Cup in the deck, so we'll have Poison in the Cup, but Heartless Act, you know, is a pretty solid removal spell, but like I said, there's other options as well in the drop slot for removal. We already went over the Elvish War Master. He's overall a pretty good card. We got Rune of Might in the deck. It's just kind of interesting. I don't really know if 100% if I'm sold on it. It is nice to kind of give something like our Renata called the Hunt, you know, trample to make it that much stronger, just because it gets very strong and powerful pretty quickly because there's a decent amount of devotion in the deck, especially when we start getting a lot of elves out on the battlefield. And then you know, giving it trample helps us get through for additional damage, as we really don't have any creatures that are going to be able to, you know, go through creatures with any sort of spell like that. So I thought, you know, might as well have a card that helps us draw a card and gives us, you know, additional ability of +1/+1 and trample. Like I said before, we got Poison in the Cup in the deck. I actually kind of enjoy Poison in the Cup. I know it maybe not as popular as the other removal spells because it does cost 1 additional mana. It is a double black cost and removal, but we can always foretell it, and in the later game we can always play for its foretell cost to get the scry ability on top of removing a creature. I kind of like that flexibility in there. We can kind of set up something like a big removal on a creature that we can get rid of. Next creature is Boreal Outrider. It's a 3 mana 3/2, and then whenever we cast a creature spell, if any snow was of that spell was cast to cast that spell, we can have that creature enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. So just additional ways for our creatures to come in the battlefield a little bit stronger than they would normally, since we don't have any way of like playing something like because we're playing limited rares, we don't have any way of playing any of the other rare or mythic cards that would allow us to get additional counters and or give our creatures +1/+1. Allowing our smaller creatures to get additional +1/+1 I think is overall pretty good. Then you got Landlord Visionary. That's another way to produce some additional mana. It's a 2/2 for 3 mana, but allows us to also draw a card, which I think is okay in the 3-drop slot, especially in a budget style deck. Sure, we're not really ramping for anything too large, but having the ability to draw additional cards is always a good thing in a deck that doesn't really have many ways to draw cards, so I thought it was an okay play. We got Herald's King of the Skemfor. It's a 3 mana 3/2 with Menace. Enters battlefield, we get to look at top 5 cards of our library. We may reveal an Elf, Warrior, or Tyvar card among them, put it into our hand, put the rest on our in our bottom of our library in any order. So a good way to kind of dig a little bit deeper, maybe draw into an additional elf, maybe Elvish War Master, another elf to play for War Master. Just an overall better way to kind of dig a little bit deeper, try to find an answer. Sure, we don't play too many elves in the deck as a whole, just because there's not many elves that we can really play. Fuck off. So overall, I mean, it's a pretty good elf to play in the deck, just as another way to draw. Like I said, we got Renata, just a kind of like our big creature. We don't have too many big creatures. Sure, doesn't gain the benefit of any of our elf abilities, but it's a good thing to target with a fight spell and or just get in with a Rune of Might, making it that much stronger. Like I said, also helps our elves come into the battlefield with additional +1/+1 counters with no really other thing other than pick into the battlefield afterwards. So that's kind of a good ability, so they come in that much stronger, and it has Devotion of Green, so a lot of our things have green devotion on them that will be on the battlefield, so it could be pretty strong when it comes out at 4 mana. It itself gives itself to devotion, so it can already come in the battlefield with whatever green devotion we have +2, so that's definitely very good. And then I thought Return Upon the Tide was kind of an interesting card. I haven't really seen too much play with it. In my testing, it seemed to be okay. I didn't cast it a lot, but the idea here is it kind of helps us reoccur some things that we may have lost into the graveyard, with the ability here of, return target creature from our graveyard. If it was an elf, create 2 1/1 elf warrior creature tokens on the battlefield. So if our Elvish War Master dies, we can bring it back onto the battlefield. We can foretell it and set it up in the later game, especially when something does die. Just another way to kind of help get stuff back onto the battlefield if there's a board wipe or something like that. Getting something back on the battlefield after a board wipe and then coming in the back and then getting another creature +2 1/1s, I think overall is pretty good for the cost. And I think it gets better, especially when you start getting into the more rare mythic, elves that you can always add to the deck. So like with our land base, it's pretty straightforward. We got 8 snow-covered swamps, 8 snow-covered forests, 4 woodland chasms, and 4 Shimmer Drift Vales. The Shimmer Drift Vale is kind of one of those interesting ones in the sense that I don't see too many people play it, but I kind of like the idea here that it's a land that we can choose a color when it comes into the battlefield. Even though it comes into the battlefield tapped, and we kind of make it that color, so we can choose it to either be green or black for the deck depending on what we need. The downfall is it does come into play tap, but I think it's overall a pretty decent card for a budget kind of style deck to kind of help fix our mana. I tried this out instead of doing like something like Evolve in Wilds, because I think it does exactly the same thing. Sure, you get your green or black mana, but it's going to come into play tap regardless, so I figured I'd as well play a land that's also a snow land and get to choose it as it comes into play. Moving on to the sideboard, these are the cards that you can always bring in depending on what you're trying to build first. This is like the more rare mythics that you can definitely bring in. One is being Darkboard Pathway. Sure, it kind of doesn't help our snow permanent thing, but I think it's a pretty good card because it's a land that you can choose when it comes in the battlefield, either green or black, which would probably replace that this snow land, the Shimmer Drift. So you can definitely bring in the Darkboard Pathways. Then we got Herald Be Nice to Elves, which is a very solid 4 mana equipment, or saga. I mean, you've seen some of the more typical elf decks. This card's pretty good once you start getting a lot of elves in the deck, because we build 3 cards. If we build an elf or a Tyvar card from graveyard, we get to put on the battlefield for 4 mana, which is pretty good. And then Saga 2 is we get to put a +1/+1 counter on each elf we control. And then Saga 3 is whenever elf we control attacks this turn, target creature gets an opponent controls get -1/-1. So essentially, we have a very wide board because of all the tokens and stuff we've generated. Our elves will start pinging off, creatures on our opponent's side of the board by giving a -1/-1, which is definitely a good way to get around something destructible. So there is that as a thing, because -1/- counters is different than destroy target creature. So if an indestructible creature goes down to 0, it actually gets killed. Of course, you got Tyvar, just for the ability that makes our elves produce additional mana, because it's always good to have additional mana. For zero loyalty, we can get a 1/1 elf warrior creature. -6, we get an emblem whenever we cast an elf spell. It gains haste until end of turn, and we draw 2 cards. But the +1 as well is also very good because it's just an additional way to, put a +1/+1 counter on our target elf, give it Death Touch until end of turn, so make our elves a little bit more threatening. We can always swing it with tokens and give it Death Touch and have it come into play with, make it more aggressive against our opponent. Canopy Technician is kind of interesting here. This is something I probably would put in the place of something like Landlord Visionary, because it's also like an elf lord. It gives all our other elves +1/+1. It makes 3 mana, which helps us, dig a little, play our big abilities like on our Elvish War Master. Being able to play that Elvish War Master ability that costs 7 normally costs, a little bit less because we have a creature that can produce 3 mana by itself. Actually pretty good, and it's a 3/3, pretty solid. Wildborn Preserver is actually also interesting. You wouldn't think it's actually a elf, but it's actually an elf on a fox. So there is that, and has flash reach, so we can kind of surprise our opponent. And whenever another non-human creature enters the battlefield under our control, you can pay X. When you do, get to put additional +1/+1 counters on Wildborn Preserver. So he eventually becomes our very big pump creature in the deck, and he can pick things off out of the air if our opponent tries to attack us from the top. So that's definitely something I would say that would definitely fit in the deck pretty good. And on top of it, the counters from War Master also have this ability trigger, so we can actually play this on the battlefield. If we have open mana after we play it, we can then tap that at open mana to then put counters on it pretty much immediately once it's on the battlefield. Then we got Scamfar Avenger. It's also one of those things that's actually pretty decent. Sure, it's only a 3/1 for 2 mana, but whenever a non-token elf or berserker we control dies, we get to draw a card and gain a life, just giving us another way to dig a little bit deeper in our deck. And it's only 2 mana, so it's not too bad. It's kind of a threat if our opponent doesn't deal with it. Essentially what happens after we kind of go into the sideboard and as you craft the deck up, you want to go more strictly into elves as a whole. So you want to make the deck around elves, which then will make the deck perform very good. I actually experimented with having Herald in the deck the way this deck is, and didn't have in Elvish War Master, and it didn't really work too well because we'd milled the first chapter. So I would definitely say Elvish War Master is probably the way you want to go. Probably maybe then want to go into something like Herald the Elves, or something like Wildborn Preserver, or even Pathways, because lands are always good. If you have lands that don't come into play tap, that means you can play more aggressively, in the sense that you'll be able to play more things. Tyvar is definitely a great card. I don't think you need like 4 copies of him, but having 2 or 3 at least is probably good in the deck to kind of just get what he does in, because he essentially allows us to kind of speed up what we're trying to do. Overall, Canopy Technician, like I said, replaces Landlord Visionary, but if you don't have this card for a while, Visionary's doing just as fine. Sure, it doesn't produce 3 mana, but it helps you draw a card, so it's one or the other. But overall, you can build with the sideboard the way you want to. But moving on to the next deck, let's talk about that one. So this next deck is kind of interesting here. I didn't really know where to go on this, like 100%, but I was kind of intrigued on what I wanted to do with it. And that is, it's a Boros Dwarf deck. So essentially the way this is, a card that was kind of in the format for a longest time, and I feel like it didn't see any plays, a card called 7 Dwarves. It's a 2 mana 2/2, but it gets +1/+1 for each other card we name 7 Dwarves we control. So essentially every time we play additional 7 Dwarves, all our Dwarves then that are named 7 Dwarves, we get 1 additional +1/+1. So we play 1, then we play 2, it's the 3/3s, so on and so forth. The other interesting thing is our deck can have up to 7 of them, so hence the name 7 Dwarves. And if you have all 7, that means you're gonna have additional +7/+7. Sure, that's a very far-fetched thing, but kind of a cool ability for 2 mana. Sure, it doesn't seem too great, but draw multiple, play them both on the battlefield. These can become big threats pretty quickly, and your opponent has to kind of deal with them. So I kind of try to build a deck around this card, and a mixture of some other equipment and things like that. So talking about the deck as a whole, like I said, the deck is kind of built around, for the most part, Dwarves. We don't really play anything outside of Dwarves. And it's Boros, because Boros I feel like is the deck that you want to play something kind of aggressive like this. So I think everything just fits. So in the 2-drop slot, there's no 1-drop Dwarves, unfortunately. So in the 2-drop slot, we're playing Kabir Takedown because we have ways to get additional Dwarves on the battlefield, and we have a decent amount of creatures. I thought this was a good way to deal some damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to the number of creatures we control for 2 mana, or it can be a land if we really need the white mana. But the flexibility is definitely very good. We got the Rune Master Sustenance because it is a Dwarf deck, and I would say the Runeforged Dwarf is definitely the Dwarf I would want to bring in first, out of the rares that already are playing in the deck. Rune of Sustenance is definitely a good rare, definitely good to have, given our creatures lifelink. You know, is definitely a good way. You know, give something like a 7 doors lifelink, and if it's like a 4/4 or something like that, you know, you're gonna start getting chunks of life at a time, and you can attack more aggressively. Then we got Story Seeker, which is an interesting dwarf. I mean, sure, it's not great. It's a very vanilla dwarf in a sense that it's a 2 mana 2/2 with lifelink. Sure, the lifelink's great. Maybe you put something on like, you know, you get this thing pumped up or something with maybe our equipments or something in the deck. But overall, it's an okay 2 mana curve budgety style dwarf for the deck. Then we got Magda, the Brazen Outlaw. This is our rare. We're only playing 3 copies because it's legendary. You could play 4 copies if you wanted to, but I thought 3 copies was probably good because you don't want to draw more than 1, and 3 is probably that right amount if you want to try to draw them, hopefully all the time, but not too much where you have multiples in your hand. But it's interesting because this is like essentially the Dwarf board. Makes all our doors get +1/+0. Whenever a Dwarf control becomes tapped, create a treasure token. And if we sacrifice 5 treasures, search your library for an artifact card or dragon card, put onto the battlefield, and shuffle your library. So this is actually where it gets interesting, because once you start accessing like more rares and stuff like that, you can essentially throw an equipment on a creature that maybe, you know, you swing in very aggressively. You create the 5 treasure tokens, or over the process of the game you create the 5 treasure tokens, and essentially you can search for, I would say, an equipment card. Once we get in kind of those, you'll kind of understand why, and equip it immediately to your creature if they have that ability when it comes into the battlefield. So this card overall is pretty interesting. It helps us kind of ramp up a little bit to be a little bit more aggressive because we'll have more mana open to do more things. So overall, pretty good card, and it, like I said, it is a pretty good card once you start getting it going. Of course, you know, Rimrock Knight is a very common card you see in most mono red decks. 2 mana 3/1, can't block unfortunately, but the 1 mana pump target creature until end of turn +2/+0 is very good, especially in this deck. So you attack a little more aggressively, catch your opponent off guard, and then make it a creature afterwards. So overall, pretty good card. We got Rune of Speed, yet again another rune in the deck. Just another way to draw more cards. You know, we can play it on creatures or equipments. So if equipped creature has Summon Sickness and we have this on our equipment, you know, that essentially the creature now will have haste. Additionally, +1/+0, and we get to draw a card. So just all in all, runes are pretty good in, I guess, the budget style. Already went over 7 Dwarves. We have 7 of them in the deck because, you know, we want to try to get them as often as possible and have as many as possible on the battlefield. Then we got Chanter Scald. This one's very interesting. Whenever it becomes tapped, if it's enchanted or equipped, it gets a 2/1 Dwarf Berserker creature token. This is kind of one of those interesting ones. It's probably on the fray. It's probably one of the first to go, maybe before the Forge Champion. Just because, you know, it's definitely not guaranteed that he's always going to be enchanted or equipped. But, you know, if he is, you know, you get to start pumping out tokens, which is definitely very good, which then triggers more Magda triggers. So overall, pretty interesting card here. Then we got Bearded Axe, which is actually, you would say, it's like, okay, so it's a 3 mana equipment that costs 2 to equip. But the interesting thing here, since we're playing Dwarf Tribal, our equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each dwarf, equipment, and or vehicle we control. So the deck is dwarves or equipment, so we're definitely going to have one of those on the battlefield. So, you know, depending on how many we have, you know, this creature could get +2/+2, +3/+3, +4/+4. Heck, even if you just have this out on turn, 3 and equip it on turn 4, and you haven't played another dwarf, you know, at least your creature is going to at least have a +1/+1. So, and the dwarf itself, so it's at least +2/+2, which is not too bad for 3 mana. Essentially, it just gets bigger and bigger. The more things you have on the battlefield that kind of pump it up overall. Then we got Breakneck Berserker. It's a 3 mana 3/2 with haste. You know, it's a very aggressive card for 3 mana. Sure, it only has 2 bodies, so it's easily shockable or removable like that. But, you know, you can attack aggressively. If we have other things on the battlefield that give +1/+0, put a nice equipment on it, it definitely can attack him very aggressively. You know, deal a lot of damage pretty quickly and catch your opponent off guard. And then, of course, I threw in 1 copy of Embercleave because I think this is something you unlock as you play through all the starter decks. If I'm not right, you know, that's something I would say, you know, you can always work into. It's only 1 additional mythic. We're only playing 3 other rares and then the 1 mythic. So if you don't have any in your collection, if you have the mythic wildcard, crafting 1's okay. But this is actually where it gets interesting. Like I said before, with the Magda, if we have the 5 treasure tokens on the battlefield, we can actually sacrifice them, search our library for an equipment card. Essentially, we can search our card for our deck for an Embercleave, and essentially now equip Embercleave instantly on one of our creatures, because as this comes into the battlefield, its ability triggers, which allows us to attach to target creature control, so it creates that little bit of a combo. So if we attack him with 5 creatures, create 5 treasure tokens, sacrifice 5 treasure tokens, then search our library for an Embercleave. Embercleave on our biggest creature that our opponent maybe has to awkwardly now block, and now has +1/+1 and double strike and trample. So this is definitely a good way to help finish the deck. This is definitely a card we want to probably put more in as you get more mythic rares. But overall, it's a very solid card. And like I said, you probably want multiples in the deck so you have a higher chance of drawing them. One is probably not enough. But because I feel like you get it automatically, I felt like I couldn't not include it in this style of deck. And then overall, our mana base is pretty straightforward. It's not anything super crazy expensive. Our highest card in the deck essentially is 3, so we don't need a ton of mana. Though it would be nice to have like at least 4. So we have 7 snow-covered plains, 4 copies of Dwarf in Mine. You know, the ability to hopefully possibly get a 1/1 Dwarf. If not, you know, no big deal. But it's just an added benefit. Then we got snow-covered mountains, 8 copies. We have 4 alpine meadows. Sure, you probably don't need to play the snow lands. You can probably play just regular lands. I don't know why I actually did. I think at one point in my head when I was crafting the deck, I thought I was going to put Frostbolt in it, but I didn't. So if you want to put Frostbolt in the deck, that's always good. I would probably try to find a spot because, you know what, now looking at it, I really don't have any. My goal is just to attack your opponent as hard as possible, as quickly as possible. So maybe some Frostbites are needed in the deck. But I would say maybe test this build out and then maybe play around with it afterwards. If not, maybe just put these as normal lands and the normal tap land. So up to you. So moving on the sideboard, I really don't think there's anything too crazy that you could add to the deck to really make it that much better in the sense of rares and mythics, because we want to keep it as Dwarf Tribal. The one thing I just realized I probably could have added into the sideboard for it is, hold on one second. All right, so now going over the sideboard, one of the cards you could probably add into the deck that would probably definitely help out is Rally the Ranks. We can choose a creature type, which we choose Dwarves, and essentially creatures of the chosen type get +1/+1, which is definitely very good. Rune 4 Champion is definitely a good card in the deck, I think, just because it helps us, you know, search our library for the runes, get them to our hand, hopefully play them for 1 less mana. Essentially, you know, we can get out something like, you know, the red rune or the white rune. Maybe you can splash in other colors, but I don't really want to splash it in because if you do draw, like, let's say a blue rune or the green rune or the black rune, you don't got the Rune 4 Champion out, you have to wait until you get him in order to actually play it. So overall, I just, for now, maybe just keep in the white and red runes. Torbrand's a very solid card in the deck because it's also a Dwarf and it makes all our red permanents, whenever we deal damage with them, you know, do 2 more damage. So it just makes them that much stronger. Find that with something like Embercleave, it's definitely a good way to finish the deck. Like I said, 4 copies of Embercleave is definitely very good for the deck. It just helps us finish the game because, you know, the double strike and trample is definitely, you know, an overall benefit. Makes it definitely very awkward for our opponent to block. And in rounding out, Castle Embereth is definitely a good land in the deck. Maybe replace that with Dwarf in Mine. Maybe add an additional mountain and 3 copies of this. You know, giving our creatures additional +1/+0 overall. Because our creatures aren't very big, we can probably play a bunch of them on the battlefield. Is definitely very good. But overall, pretty good round deck. It just dawned on me as I was actually just about to wrap up this deck that actually Showdown of the Scalds is actually pretty decent here because it allows us to dig a little bit deeper into our deck and essentially allow us to exile 4 cards, and we can play those cards until our next turn that are exiled. So that means, you know, we draw 4 cards, have more plays, and then whenever we cast a spell this turn, we get to +1/+1 counter on target creature control for 2 additional chapters afterwards. So essentially, once we start playing some more spells, we'll then trigger this multiple times, put +1/+1 counters on a bunch of things, and essentially, you know, overwhelm our opponent by making our dwarves that much bigger. And a lot of, like I said, our spells are cheap for the most part, so we definitely have good way of producing a bunch of, you know, a bunch of counters on creatures and, you know, outmaneuvering our opponent in that sense. Also, before I forget, Needle Verge Pathway / Pillar Verge Pathway is also a very good land because it's an untapped land. Like I said, we don't really play anything snows, so if you replace the snow lands with regular lands, this is just a good way to have more untapped mana because we want to play aggressive. We don't want lands coming to the battlefield tapped. So playing the Pillar Verge or Needle Verge Pathway is definitely very good in the deck overall. So our next deck up on the list is an interesting deck here. I got a little bit of inspiration from a CGB video, and it kind of made me remember that this deck used to be a thing. And surprisingly, the deck to put it together, if I even still use CGB's list for the most part, and took out, like, I think, quite honest, there really wasn't too many rares in the deck. I think other than maybe a few obscure cards that you could add in for additional flavor. but I thought, you know, this deck was pretty solid for what it's trying to do. And this is actually mono black auras. So essentially what the way the deck works is that we kind of build it around this card called Faithful Eidolon. It's a 1-mana 1/2 lifelinker. Whenever enchanted creature dies, we get to draw a card for each aura we control that was attached to it. So essentially our removal in the deck in a way is playing things like Deadweight, which gives target creature -2/-2, and also things like Mire's Grasp. Essentially, these are just 2 ways to put auras on it, and then we can stack them on our opponent's creatures, make them die instantly. And then the way we kind of reoccur this, so we can kind of take advantage of it and draw a bunch of cards, is we actually play Luris as our commander or our Kangen, because he allows us to play permanent cards from our graveyard with a permanent cost 2 or less once per turn. So definitely a good way to reoccur those spotty removals. The other thing too we also do in the deck as kind of like a different engine as well, we play Archfiend's Vessel. That's kind of like our big card in the deck. We really don't have like a big finisher. We're just kind of pecking away at our opponent's creatures with Deadweights and Mire's Grasp, and then setting up for hopefully an Archfiend's Vessel that we're going to resummon from the graveyard. So that's like our main win condition. We do play other things to kind of get things back from the graveyard creature-wise, as like called the Death Dweller. So in case our Luris gets removal, it's kind of like protection. We can also get things like Faithful Eidolon. Back from graveyard, we play Kitesail Freebooter, which is a 2-mana 1/2 flyer, enters the battlefield. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-creature, non-land card from it. Exile that card until it leaves the battlefield. So essentially, we can take a peek at what our opponent's doing, and then we just get to take a card if they have any non-creature spells in their hand. The other cards we have in the deck are Mogi's Favor. It's a 1-mana enchantment, gives target creature +1 or +2/-1. In a way, if our opponent's playing like 1/1s, we can put it on something like that, kill it pretty easily for 1 mana. The other thing too is on our creatures, if we're not drawing something like Archfiend's Vessel or something like that, we can actually put on something like a Hateful Eidolon, make it a 4/3, make it a 3/3/1 with lifelink, so we can attack it a little bit more aggressively. It also has an escape ability, so for 3 mana we can exile 2 other cards from our graveyard to kind of, you know, thin our graveyard out for playing something like Rogues, and we don't want them to get, you know, us being at 8 or more cards. Definitely a good reoccurring spell that we can always keep on playing out from the graveyard. We also play Heartless Act in the deck as kind of like a spot removal. Sure, we have a lot of spot removal. There is a lot of spot removal in this deck. Maybe you don't need all of it, but as you kind of go into the sideboard, you can kind of take out some of the spot removal, even the auras. But we have Heartless Act for additional spot removal since we don't have like a board wipe. We also have Poison the Cup in the deck as another spot removal. Maybe you don't need 6 copies of additional spot removal on top of the Mire's Grasp and Deadweight, but like I said, no board wipes. Might as well have more spot removal. Then we have Pelika Predation, which essentially is another way for us to attack our opponent's hand. If they reveal their hand, we choose a card with a permanent cost 3 or greater. That player discards that card. Or if we feel like our opponent's playing something like another Luris deck like Rogues, maybe we don't have a bunch of spells that we can hit with this, might as well play on the battlefield as a land. And then, like I said, we have Call of the Death Dweller. And the mana base is pretty straightforward. We play 23 copies of Swamps. You know, I guess we play 26 lands if we count this. But overall 23 Swamps, which makes it very easy to craft land-wise. There's nothing too crazy. In our sideboard, we got some options here. If you feel like you got too much removal, you want to, you know, maybe get a little more hand hate. We have Duress as another idea. We also have Agonize Remorse. Just 2 different cards I feel like you replace maybe some of the removal with. You know, choose which one you like better. Agonize Remorse is, I feel like, better because it exiles that card, but we do lose a life. You have Valky, the God of Lies, in the sideboard here, because you could probably replace removal with Valky here. Also, you know, splash in a little bit of red mana, like in Blightstep Pathway, just so we can cast the Tibalt on the other side. So there's that. Castle Locthwain, because it's very easy to play on the battlefield untapped, and we get to draw cards as our hands thinning out a little bit by paying 3 mana. And then Haggard Maulin's another interesting removal spell because of its flexibility. Destroy target creature, and it costs 1 less if our opponent controls no basics. The meta is kind of weird, so sometimes you feel like your opponent's not playing a lot of basics, because I feel like a lot of people are playing a lot of colors, so there's a little bit more flexibility in that. So this is definitely a good way to kind of, you know, maybe get this into play for 3 if you're lucky. But overall, if you don't need more removal, you can always play in the battlefield as a tapped land. But overall, this is mono black auras. It's pretty straightforward deck, pretty simple, pretty fun. Definitely very mono black deck. And then moving on to the last deck, this one's very interesting. So this last deck is a deck that I saw that I think a lot of people have tried. And I was like, it's a very good deck. But I was like, is there a way we could build a version of it that is easier for someone on a budget to possibly play? And that is Naya combo, or Naya Fling, or whatever you want to call it. So essentially the way the deck works is you're playing a card called Unleash Fury. It's a card from M21. It's a 2-mana instant speed spell that doubles the target power of target creature in a turn. So essentially the way you're doing it here is there's a card called Goldspan Dragon. We're only playing 2 copies of because it's mythic. I didn't want to add 4 copies because it makes it a little more difficult to cast. So we only did 2, and you can work your way up to 4 copies eventually. But essentially Goldspan Dragon is whenever it attacks or becomes target of a spell, create a treasure token. And its additional ability is treasure tokens we control have sacrifice at 2 mana of any one color. So essentially every time we target it with a spell, you're going to produce free 2 mana. So the way you kind of do is you kind of combo off with this by, casting something like this out, attack in with it, create a treasure token, hopefully have an Unleashed Fury in your hand. You're then going to double the power of target creature until end of turn, making a 4/4 into an 8/4. Possibly even if you have another one, you can make it into a 16/4. And then if you have extra mana open, you can always throw a Causal Fury and throw it at its face. So essentially that is the deck. It's kind of like a Naya Adventures deck with like a combo built in. And there's a few cards that I kind of replaced just because I didn't want to put the rares in there that make the deck overall probably the way you may see it in the competitive play. So this is kind of like the budget version of the competitive deck. So in the 1-drop slot, we have the Fairy Guidemother. Essentially, this is like the Giant Killer slot. So I just kind of have this as a placeholder, but I felt like maybe, with Goldspan Dragon, this is just another way to produce additional mana. So for 2 mana, we can give target creature +2/+1 and fly until end of turn. So, this creates, a treasure token from something like Goldspan Dragon. Then we have Shock, which is, this is kind of like the Bone Crusher slot. I thought Shock, because it can deal with any target, I thought was a good replacement. Though it doesn't produce a creature, I thought Shock is good for the spot removal. Edgewall Innkeeper is like a good staple card in the deck because most of our creatures in the deck have Adventure for the most part, and whenever we cast a creature with Adventure, we draw a card. So this is kind of like our card draw engine. We do have a lot of creatures that do have that. We got Surgy Shelter, which is an interesting card in the deck. Gives target creature we control protection of a particular color to end of turn. So kind of giving our creature possibly pumping with Unleashed Fury protection. If our opponent decides to target with a spell to remove it in the process, or we can play it as a land if our opponent's tapped out and we want to just get additional mana on the battlefield. Shepherd the Flock is another interesting protection spell in a way because we can protect the creature by bouncing it back into our hand and maybe replay it, or we want to put something like a Rimrock Knight or a Fairy Guidemother back into our hand and then replay it that way so we get the additional pump effect. But overall, Shepard the Flock is definitely a decent card, and it's a 3/1 overall as well. So definitely 2 mana 3/1 is okay after playing it. For 2 mana, it's also triggering pretty easily with the Edgewall Innkeeper. Rimrock Knight is another interesting card here. It's actually not supposed to be in here. There really isn't a way to replace the Saga, the blue, white, red Saga Showdown of the Scalds. So I was like, might as well just throw more pumps in the deck. Might as well give us other ways to maybe hit our opponent as hard as possible. Combine this with something like an Unleashed Fury. So for 3 mana, you're going to make a creature additional +2/+0 and then double it from there, making that much stronger. So might as well. And of course, yet again, we get a 3/1 out of it that can't block, but it's still a 3/1, so we can be aggressive. So Rimrock Knight is where I went with that. Cosmos Fury is like our Fling spell. As additional cost to cast a spell, we can sacrifice a creature, and then it deals damage equal to sacrifice creature's power to any target. So we take our very big creature we have in the deck, and then we throw that damage wherever we need to, usually the opponent's face if we hit them already really hard. We throw it at their face and hopefully win the game that way. Like I said before, Goldspan Dragon, this is definitely the card that helps us produce the mana to kind of, go off by playing a bunch of spells to kind of combo off on our opponent, essentially hitting them real hard in one turn by producing additional mana, and then we fling it in their face. And then the last card here, which is kind of like the Lovestruck Beast slot, and that is the Beanstalk Giant. I thought this was kind of interesting here in the sense as, one, it's, we can help ramp a little bit, especially if we're kind of stuck because we don't really have any way of searching our library for lands because I didn't put in Evolve Wilds to replace the Fabled Passages that you probably would sideboard in or add in as you get more rares and stuff. But so I went with the idea here that it helps us search our library for a basic land card put on the battlefield. And then on top of it, in the late game, if we have a lot of mana, we can play it for the mana cost of 7, and at least it's 7/7 on the battlefield, which then we can turn this card into another target. We can throw something like Unleashed Fury on. So you take something like this, a 7/7, double the power, it's a 14/7, hit them for 14 possibly, or make them have to block 14, and then we fling the 14 damage at their face. So just additional way to deal that much additional damage to our opponent's face. Is kind of where I went with when it came to build in like this budget style version of that deck. Mana base is kind of interesting. Like I said, I didn't put any ways of searching for mana other than the Beanstalk Giant. So we have 5 plains, 6 mountains, 4 forests, 3 rugged highlands, and 4 windscarred crags. Reason why there's 1 less of these is we don't really play a lot of green, so this is more of a splash. And I figured that there's a lot more white kind of than there is green, so I want one more copy of this. And then there's a lot of red in the deck, so red's kind of the highest amount of basics / duels. And then like I said, the sideboard, giant killers replace the guide mothers, one creature giants replaces shocks, while Silk Beast replaces the beanstalk giants, Showdown the Scalds replaces the Rimrock Knight, Boltspan Dragon add the additional copies, Pathways will replace the tap lands, and then you can also add in this as an additional tap for additional other lands, so you have more ways to filter your mana the way you want to. So you probably cut down on some of your basics to do that. Then Fabled Passage as well to help you search maybe for that particular land that you may not be drawing. Probably only 2 copies though, because if we're playing all these non-basics as 12 copies, you don't really have 2 basics left in the deck at that point. And then the mana base is actually, it's 28, I think, because of the modal lands. So it says 22, but that's not actually right, because essentially you can play this for 4 copies as a red, you can play this for 4 copies as a white if you need it. But overall, that's the deck. It's definitely a very interesting deck out of all of them. It's the only one I took from a competitive deck, and I tried to make a budget version of it. So I mean, if you decide to try this version out as you're building up to possibly play the Naya playing combo deck, let me know in the comments below. But guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps the channel out a lot. Lets me know you guys like these videos. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I'll see you in the next Magic the Gathering video.